But I'm really honored to be here and to speak at this conference, and I was delighted to get to come back to North Carolina. I've had two near brushes of becoming a citizen of North Carolina, and so I'm happy to be back here. I'm always impressed with how much the citizens and the state of North Carolina do to take care of their history and their historic sites. You are the envy of Virginia and Tennessee, let me tell you. So, there you go. And it really is a privilege for me to be at the Hermitage. I've been there a little over 5.5 years, and presidential history is my thing. And so I'm just very honored to be there. So I'm going to kind of move through this quickly. So these are the points that I'll hit this afternoon. Why is the Hermitage important? I think we all know that, but it's always good for a refresher. A little bit about Andrew Jackson. I think you all are well aware of him, though, coming from Salisbury, and this being one of those pivot points in his life, or an inflection point in his life. The Hermitage as an institution, kind of pulling back the curtain. And what is the Hermitage today? What are we involved in right now? What are the projects that are going on? And questions and answers. And I'm a pretty informal speaker. So if I'm saying something and you go, what? Or if a question comes up, just raise your hand in the course, and I'm happy to answer any questions. But as I always say to a group, I reserve the right to make up the answer. So you just never know. So why is the Hermitage special? What makes it important? And we've been doing a lot of planning recently, the last 3 years, for the future of the Hermitage. Last summer, I had a friend of mine who's been involved in preservation and in historic sites and with UNESCO for most of her life, and she'd never been to the Hermitage before. And we did the tour and behind the scenes, and I was walking her out to the parking lot, and she said, "Howard, this is a 1,000-year site. It needs to be here 1,000 years from now. It's so important to our nation's history." And that's why we're doing all the planning right now. And one of the people that we brought on to help us is Dan Jordan, and he's the now retired president of Monticello. He was my mentor as well. But this is a quote that he gave that has become our mantra, that Andrew Jackson and his home, the Hermitage, are American icons. Both deserve the highest level of stewardship possible. And that's driving our planning today, both in terms of our preservation work and in terms of our interpretive work and our promotional work as well. So what the Hermitage is, it's the second presidential museum. The first one was Mount Vernon, and I'll embroider on that a bit later. It was the first Tennessee historic site. It's the first site in Tennessee that the state purchased for preservation. It's one of the earliest national historic landmarks. In fact, it was landmarked before there was a program. It's one of the leading Tennessee tourist attractions. We get about 180,000 visitors a year. Our goal is 250,000 a year. Back in the late 80s, we had over 300,000 visitors a year. And so we're taking steps to regain ground that had been lost through the 90s and the last decade. And we see it, probably most importantly, as a place to inspire and educate. Jackson, we think, is the quintessential self-made American. And his story is the story of what anyone can do with a lot of drive and determination and being ruthless, frankly. In fact, I was going back and looking up in Robert Remney's first volume of his 3-volume biography of Jackson, and I was looking up what he wrote about, or what he includes in that volume about Salisbury. And he has several great quotes that I'll hold off till later. But one of the quotes, this is during Jackson's first presidential campaign, and it's a woman, a resident of Salisbury, who is sort of tirading about Jackson and the life that he led when he was here. And she wraps it up by saying, "If Andrew Jackson can be president, then anybody can be president." And that's it in a nutshell. Jackson was the common man who made good. And that's really the nucleus of his story. Born in a log cabin, dies in a mansion, and in the middle was the president. So it's a great, great story that we share. So what's most important about Jackson, though, is that it's his home. He was a Tennessee pioneer. He arrived when Tennessee was still part of North Carolina. He was an entrepreneur. He was a land speculator that got his wealth started. But he owned general stores. He built boats. He basically did anything he needed to do to generate revenue. He was a farmer, and the Hermitage was his principal source of income. It was a cotton plantation. He was a lawyer, earned here in North Carolina, a judge, part of what today would be called a Supreme Court judge of Tennessee. He was the first congressman from Tennessee and helped write the state's first constitution, and was briefly the territorial governor of Florida, kind of sent there both as punishment and also to enforce American law or impose American law on what had been a Spanish colony. He was a military leader, and that's probably what most people know him as today, other than president, and that hero of New Orleans. And that battle, and that took him from being a prominent Tennessean onto the national stage and into the White House. So that Battle of New Orleans is one that we focus on a great deal, and we'll be doing so in the coming months, and as we have been. And in his time, he was seen as, by many people, the second only to George Washington. And the result is that we have a number of objects in our collection that were given to Jackson that had either belonged to Washington or have a Washington associations because of that connection Americans were making to him. He then, most importantly, was our 7th American president, who radically changed the presidency, and an elder statesman. And the Hermitage that you visit today is the home of the elder statesman. As I said, it's the Battle of New Orleans, and this is a very romanticized image of Jackson from much later than the war. It is not period. And thinking about Don's comments this morning, this becomes that romanticized vision or version of Andrew Jackson, but it's the vision that people had of him. So as president, and I get beaten up for this regularly, but he really was our first rock star president. He was wildly popular because he was of the common man. He was the first president from west of the Allegheny Mountains. So he really took on the East Coast establishment. He saw himself as the leader of the democracy and certainly one of the founders of the Democratic Party. He believed himself to be the president, to be the representative of all the people, the only elected person in the United States who represented all of the people. The members of the House of Representatives represented their districts. The Senate represented the states that they came from at that time. But the president represented all the people. And he firmly believed that what the policies he created or pushed were policies that would benefit the general population. Now, that wasn't always the case, but that was his position. John Meacham, his most recent biographer, says that he was our first modern president in terms of making the president co-equal to Congress in terms of its power. And in fact, through all 8 years of his presidency, he argued continually with Congress and fought bitterly with Congress over the power of the president versus the power of Congress. And to my mind, I think one of the things we should remember about him most is that he held the Union together at a time when the seams were starting to come apart, and it was through sheer force of will. Now, the image on the screen here is Jackson's presidential portrait, and to me, it says it all. I love the symbolism of this painting. It was done by Ralph E.W. Earl, who lived in the White House with the Jackson family and lived at the Hermitage. But Jackson was 6'1". He weighed about 140 pounds. His weight varied from 135 to 140 pounds. He's tall and just thin as a rail. So as president, you want to have a presence. You want to invoke power. So Jackson would wear capes to bulk himself up, to look bigger. So here he is standing on the south portico of the White House with a cape thrown open lined with red. So he's symbolizing his power. His hand is resting on one of the columns of the White House. Again, typical in portraiture, it's symbolizing power. Your hand is resting on a column. The chair to his right is some of the furniture that President Monroe bought for the White House when the White House was built after the War of 1812. So he's making the connection, or Earl, who set this up, is making the connection to Jackson and his predecessors. But I mentioned, so there's all these trappings of power with Jackson in the foreground. And Jackson saw the presidency, saw himself as so important. So the little white building in the background is the Capitol building. So here, Congress is diminished to the background, and the president is in the foreground. And the final version of the portrait, which is in the American National Portrait Gallery, Jackson is a full 6'1", so it's a huge portrait. We have the study for the portrait in Jackson's library, the preliminary one that Earl did. But I love that portrait because it is just loaded with symbolism of how Jackson saw himself. And of course, there's the challenging Jackson that we deal with all the time. He had this quick temper. He was irascible, mercurial. He was a duelist, and there are just outrageous stories floating around, especially now on the internet, about Jackson and dueling. Truth of the matter is that he only was in one duel where shots were fired. He challenged a number of people to duels. He threatened duels. But there was only the one duel with Charles Dickinson in 1806 when he killed Dickinson that Jackson ever was in a duel where a shot was fired. Recently, something came through on the internet that he'd killed 101 men in duels. And, we're going, really? What? But the result of that duel is, though, that Jackson carried a bullet in his chest for the rest of his life. For 39 years, he had a bullet lodged between his left lung and his heart. And that caused tremendous physical problems and illnesses for him for the rest of his life. So the duel was no small thing. He was a slave owner, and from every account, there aren't any accounts that suggest that he ever questioned the morality of slavery. It was just part of the system he lived in. And Jackson, if nothing else, was about raising his own status. I would love us to have a center at the Hermitage to really address not just Jackson and that one act, but to really address the whole relationship between Native Americans and the United States and put him into context. Because he did reflect, he was at the leading edge, but he did reflect the majority thinking at that time in our history. And then lastly, the Bank War. And while it was an economic battle, it certainly presented him as someone who would go to battle and over whatever issue he felt was wrong. And he certainly felt that the Second Bank of the United States and that corporation and its ties to the federal government was disadvantaging the average yeoman. So we deal with these challenges right up front. There's nothing that we don't duck about Jackson. So now getting to the Hermitage. So the Hermitage, when we think about it as this gracious mansion, but it really was the source of the bulk of his wealth from 1804 through the rest of his life. It was a cotton plantation, and he actively cultivated it. He built a cotton gin at the plantation that he used to gin his own cotton. But the next closest cotton gin to us was about 20 miles away. So he brought in the cotton from the surrounding plantations and ginned it there to add to the family's income. When he first bought the Hermitage in 1804, it was about 425 acres. Over the course of his life, he expanded it at one point up to 1,800 acres. But he was continually buying and selling land, selling it to other members of his wife's family or selling it to neighbors. By the time he died, the Hermitage was 1,050 acres, give or take. So it expanded and contracted because he was always buying and selling land. But cotton was the source of his wealth. He had another plantation in Alabama as well. And when he and Rachel, his wife, bought the plantation, they moved into this 2-story log farmhouse. And we think about a log cabin as being rustic and crude. And by this point in Tennessee's history, it wasn't like a log cabin. It was really a farmhouse. And in fact, they had a much finer house at the plantation before the Hermitage, filled with Tennessee-made federal-style furniture and a great quantity of silver, and a very nicely outfitted house that moved to this. Jackson had lost the other plantation and paid off his debt, and with the money he had left, bought the beginnings of the Hermitage and moved Rachel into this house in 1804. The inside was paneled on one floor. The second floor had French wallpaper. So it wasn't completely rustic. And we're very fortunate because part of that building still survives. The lower corner, the picture in the lower right-hand corner, is what survives of that original log farmhouse. It's actually the second floor of the farmhouse. We don't know what happened to the first floor, but the second floor has survived. And for us to interpret the life of Jackson, it gives us a great visual of the arc of his life from log cabin to one of the finest homes in Tennessee at that time. And they lived there from 1804 until 1821. And in 1821, they moved into the beginnings of what is the Hermitage Mansion that we know today. Partially because of the War of 1812 and all of his business dealings, Jackson's wealth increased, and they started in 1819 building this new house. It was a large federal-style 8-room brick house with center halls. It was fairly simple and definitely out of style by East Coast standards. But in Tennessee, you find similar houses to this of the same period, and nicely furnished. That's the house Rachel knew. That's the house that she lived in with Andrew from 1821 until 1828 when she died. And the only image we have, only period image we have of that house is in the little oval there, and it's actually in the background of a portrait of Jackson. So that's really all we know about that original house. That house was expanded when Jackson became president, but then burned in 1834. There was a chimney fire, and it burned the second floor and damaged the first floor and damaged the wings. So and at this point, Jackson is in Washington. His son and daughter-in-law his son is married. His son and daughter-in-law are living at the Hermitage with their children. And there's a big debate ensues. Should they rebuild the Hermitage? Should they build a new house somewhere else on the property? What should they do? And there's great debate at the plantation about this. Jackson from Washington writes and says, Rachel picked the site for that house. We built it together. I want it restored. Not quite in those words, but he directs, he wants the house rebuilt. His political allies in Nashville say, fine, let's rebuild the house. But it needs to look like the home of the most important man in the United States. So they hire skilled builders and they get architectural pattern books, and they convert the house into this Greek Revival mansion. They raise the height of the ceilings. They make the windows bigger. They enlarge the doorways and the windows around the doors. They install Greek Revival woodwork, flying curved stairway. They import mantels from Italy, wallpaper from France. And they put this 2-story portico across the front of the house with a gallery. Jackson really doesn't see the finished house until he returns from the presidency in March of 1837. And I love to think about him coming up the driveway and seeing this new house for the first time. And people were coming to the Hermitage from all around Middle Tennessee and other areas just to see this house, because there was nothing like it in Tennessee. So Jackson lives in the house in this version of it from 1837 until 1845 when he dies. So we interpret it from that time period. And we're very fortunate in that the family kept all the rebuilding records. And Jackson was in Washington closely monitoring how much is being spent to rebuild the house. And all those records were kept. So that we have really excellent documentation on how the house was decorated, where the furniture came from, in some cases where furniture had been positioned even in the house, and the records and the discussion about the rebuilding of the house, because it changed over time. At one point, it was going to have a third floor added to it. Wings were going to added to it, and rooms and functions moved around. So we don't have drawings, but we have great written documentation of that house. So when you visit the Hermitage today, this is the house you visit, which is really his retirement home. Rachel, if she were to come back today, would not recognize this as her home because it's so radically different than the house she knew, which was very simple, big but simple. But where you most feel Rachel is in the garden. The garden was something she loved. The letters that survive, she's writing to friends about what to plant in the garden. The few trips she made away from Nashville to New Orleans or to Washington and to Florida, she was collecting plant specimens and seeds to bring back, although she was not a trained gardener per se. And both she and Jackson's graves, their tomb is in the garden. So that's where I really feel Rachel the most, is there in the garden, because it was so important to her. And because of that, it was important to Jackson. They actually hired a British landscape designer to come and design the garden for them. When Jackson died in 1845, the Hermitage was left to his one son. And he and Rachel never had natural children of their own, but they did adopt one of her nephews when he was an infant, and they raised him as their own son and named him Andrew Jackson Jr. They were in their 40s at this point, which would be the age of grandparents. So he was coddled and indulged and spoiled. And what is not atypical of the son of a very strong man, he was not a strong man himself and was badly taken advantage of, a very bad businessman. In fact, he ran the plantation into debt while Jackson was president. Andrew Jackson Jr. and his wife Sarah from Philadelphia inherit the plantation, and within 11 years, Junior, as we call him, has run through the family's wealth, sold off half of the plantation, and in 1856 sells the rest of the plantation to the state of Tennessee. Here, going back to a point I made earlier, this is the first time that the state of Tennessee had purchased a site for its symbolism, and they did buy it to honor Andrew Jackson. But it's also the first presidential home that's been purchased for preservation. So we actually even precede Mount Vernon, which wasn't purchased until 2 years later. But Mount Vernon calls itself the first presidential home, and we give them that, because the family continued to live there for another 35 years. But the state did buy the Hermitage in 1835 to preserve it. The family, already poor, their fortunes declined even further during the Civil War. Junior dies within a week of Abraham Lincoln being assassinated. And the widow with their almost grown children is left there. So over the next 25 years, the Hermitage continues to decline. And the bottom two slides show the plantation in the 1870s. And the house is badly deteriorated. The farms, the fences are largely overgrown because they don't have slaves to run the plantation for them. So the farm contracts. Sarah lives there until 1887 when she dies. The grandson and his family continue living there. And then the state says, well, what are we going to do with this place? We own it. We haven't put any money into it. The family is still there. We need to do something with the Hermitage. And so they decide to turn the house into a home for indigent Tennessee Civil War veterans, men who didn't have families to care for them. And so they were going to live in the house and be cared for there. So in late January of 1889, a group of prominent Nashville ladies get themselves organized and within a week have themselves chartered as the Ladies Hermitage Association. Now remember, this is a time when women couldn't vote, they couldn't own land, didn't own bank accounts, and really didn't control their own children if they were widows. And this group of very intrepid ladies who would not take no for an answer got themselves chartered and then lobbied the state legislature to turn the Hermitage over to them. And there are stories of these ladies walking through the halls of the state capitol and the legislators ducking into closets to get out of their way because they did not want to be besieged by them. This is one of our early boards, and this photo dates from about 1902. And we can tell that by the little tombstone in front of them was put in 1902. And if you can get up close and you see the looks on these ladies' faces, you just know that, you know. And then I respectfully but facetiously say, this is a group of ladies you would not want to have met in a dark alley because they would break your knees. But the fact of the matter is that in February, we celebrated their 125th anniversary as an organization, and it's 125 years tomorrow that the state turned the Hermitage over to them. In fact, when the legislature passed the legislation, and one of them said, "Let them go play house." But over that 125 years, they acquired back all of the plantation that Jackson owned the day he died. So we have the 125 acres plus. They began raising the money and restored the house. They bought back the furniture and the paintings and the collections, and they turned the place into a major tourist destination. On top of that, they ran the Hermitage as a farm on their own until the 1930s. I'm sorry, 1960s. So, that's the board I still work for today. Now, it is men and women today. It became coeducational in 1990. But it's a very intrepid group of people. So the Hermitage today, in addition to the mansion, and as I said, Jackson's farm, the 1,050 acres, they bought another plantation that was owned by Jackson's nephew, Andrew Jackson Donaldson, Tulip Grove, and that's the columned building up in the upper right. We have Jackson's tomb. We have 27 buildings. There's some different numbers floating around. The church that Jackson had constructed for Rachel in the lower right-hand corner. We have several of the slave cabins that have survived from Jackson's time, and we use those a great deal in our interpretive programs. And we're bringing back some of the farming operation. And the collection, 95% of what you see in the mansion was there the day Jackson died. There is no other early presidential home that's that authentic. And because the family held on to everything, and the house literally went from being the home of the grandchildren to being a museum, and the ladies began buying things back from the family right away. So we have things that are very intimate to Jackson's life. The portrait in the center is one of my favorite portraits of Jackson. It was finished about a week before he died. It was done by an American portrait painter named George Healy, who had gone to Paris to study art. He became acquainted with the Emperor of France, Louis Philippe, and the Emperor sent him back to the United States to do portraits of notable Americans. But he specifically said, "I want a portrait of Andrew Jackson." So Healy shows up at the Hermitage 5 weeks or so before Jackson dies, and he said, "I'm here to do your portrait for the king." And Jackson had had many, many, many portraits done of him. Some say there are more life portraits of Jackson than any other president. I don't know if that's not verified. And Jackson is not interested in sitting for yet another portrait. He's ready to die. And Healy convinces him to sit for the portrait. The family is so stunned by the portrait, they love it, that they have him do a second one on the spot. So one portrait is at the Louvre, and the other portrait is at the Hermitage, and it's something that we value a great deal. You look at it, it's probably one of the best. You look at the light and the dark on his face, it's the light and the dark of Jackson. You get up close, you just see that this is a man he's just been through it all. It's all on his face, and he's tired and he's ready to go. But the whole story is there in his face, and it's just a wonderful, wonderful portrait. One of the things that we do at the Hermitage is that we don't interpret the objects. If someone asks, we can give you the provenance of something or what it is. But we really use the objects to tell the stories of Jackson. Each one has a meaning and a symbolism, and that's how we interpret it. So we have a little over 7,700 objects in what we call the Jackson collection. We have 800,000 objects in our archaeological collection. We have 30 years of archaeology at the Hermitage. Most of that collection is at Monticello right now, being cataloged by their archaeological staff. So what are we doing right now? What have we been doing the last couple of years? Well, the end of this month, we'll complete a $1.6 million restoration of the outside of the building. In the 1990s, they did a $4 million restoration of the interior. We're completing an exterior restoration of the building that we expect will, with regular maintenance, will carry it well into the 2030s before major work is needed again. We have started expanding our tours so that we have customized tours throughout the day and in the evening. Our educational programs are growing right now. They've grown by almost 200% the last couple of years. And students can come to the Hermitage to take classes. Our teachers go to the schools that don't have the money to do field trips. We have a program called Junior Docents where classes can come and be tour guides for part of the day. And then 3 years ago, we started a web-based teaching where it's live courses over the web into schools. And we're in 27 states teaching courses and in a couple of foreign countries. And we have a curriculum of 9 different classes. The most popular one is Indian removal. We're restoring the gardens now. We're replanting the gardens with period plants. They had kind of gone awry. Last fall, we launched Fall Fest at the Hermitage, which is an art festival, to bring people who aren't normally all that interested in history to come to the site and see that it's a pretty cool place. Several years, we don't know where the slaves are buried. We don't know where the slave cemetery is at the Hermitage. But for 5 years ago next month, we dedicated an enslaved memorial to the enslaved people who lived and worked at the Hermitage. And we do a ceremony and programs there. And then we're doing some tactical work now too, improving restrooms and other facilities. What's coming up next? What's next? Well, we're determined to continue our 125 years of stewardship of the mansion. Our board recently has embraced this new motto based on some plans that were done called Go Big, Go National, where we're going to make the Hermitage more of a nationally recognized site. We're developing a national board of directors. Up till now, the board has been based in Middle Tennessee. And the determination is to restore the legacy of Andrew Jackson, that we want to move what particularly younger generations know about Jackson as being not just based in slavery or Indian removal, to see the larger impact Jackson had on our country. We're offering a lot of new educational experiences for children and adults and new ways to experience the site. Last year, we introduced audio-visual. We've had audio tours for a number of years. We have audio-visual tours, and we're going to be adding like a scavenger hunt for kids on that so that kids can engage in the site in different ways. And we're doing the same with adults as well. And we're looking at new business opportunities. But probably the biggest thing that we're doing right now, and it ties back to why we're all here today, is that we're opening the beginning of next year, on January 8th of 2015, we're opening in a new interpretive program at the Hermitage, and it isn't just about the war or the Battle of New Orleans. That's the launch pad for it, is that we are opening a new exhibit called 20 Minutes That Changed the World, or Changed the Nation, and the leadership and legacy of Andrew Jackson. And we're replacing all of the interpretive content in our visitor center with a new interactive exhibit about Jackson. And this is the first major exhibit of this type at the Hermitage in a quarter of a century. We hired a nationally known exhibit firm. They're designing it right now. We're in the throes of raising the money for this exhibit. It grew from about a $200,000 project to close to $1 million project. And so this is one of the biggest fundraising efforts we've had for something of this type in a while. So it's going to trace the history of Jackson, his origins, and what made him, shaped him into the leader, into the War of 1812, the thing that really catapulted him onto the national stage, an interactive area about the Battle of New Orleans, where there'll actually be a digital, like a table, where you can watch the battle play out and you can look at different scenarios for the battle along with artifacts. You'll see there in the corner, the exhibit designers have suggested we use the word rock star and apply it to him to help people recognize the status that he had versus the term hero. And there's quite a bit of discussion about the use of the word rock star. I may get fired over this one yet. And then it moves from the Jackson as his combatant being the soldiers and the British into the next phase of his life as his combatants being his political opponents, and Henry Clay and John Quincy Adams and Jackson moving into the White House, moving into the presidency, and his story as president. So that we're in the midst of designing it right now. We're in the midst of getting the objects we need, and as I said, the midst of raising the money for it right now. It's very exciting. It's going to totally change the building that we've had as our visitor center for the last quarter of a century.